Okay, thank you. Thanks for the nice introduction. So first, this paper is with Jongwon Yoon and Jongjin Lee, and this paper was written when I was a consultant or contractor at the International Monetary Fund last summer. So I worked there for about a month, and then I wrote this paper when I was working there. And then, as nicely introduced by Professor Peng, I'm teaching economics at Korea University. And our university president will be one of the keynote speakers tomorrow morning. So usually I try to persuade the audience why population is important, because my usual audience is economists. But here I'm the opposite side. Most of you are here because you know population is important, so I should persuade you why it's important for economics and why it's important for other things you may be interested in as well. So the title is Impact of Demographic Changes on Inflation and the Macroeconomy. So the first author, Jongwon Yoon, was an executive director at the IMF for a few years. He came back to Korea last year. And then this paper was mainly kind of motivated by his discussion at the IMF, the tables. Because when people discuss about monetary policy and then global economic policy issues at the IMF, the board table, they try to understand how population changes the importance of monetary policy. So for example, the key issue was the Japanese monetary policy. And then more recently, it's the US monetary policy, the quantitative easing. And then most recently, it's the ECB. The Draghi's actions are the more important. And then the issue of population on monetary policy, that has been discussed. So actually, when I was working at the IMF, I had a chance to talk really briefly with Dr. Min Zhu, or Zhu Min, as he's known last name first in this country. And then Jongwon and I tried to chat with him about the importance, and he also agreed. I believe I saw him here at the Shanghai Forum 3 years ago. And also, this issue could be important if you have a chance to ask questions on Monday morning or evening. It's Monday evening, afternoon in the program, but it says Monday morning right outside the registration desk when Ben Bernanke was holding a Q&A session. Because when Ben Bernanke was hosting a blog dialogue with Larry Summers, a former secretary of, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Former secretary, or Treasury Secretary. One of the issues why monetary policy or fiscal policy could be important is exactly the issue of the population. So I was really kind of embarrassed when I was talking Sergei's talk, because economist is the one who kind of persuade people about the constant dollars, but we are still using the old methodology of the traditional aging from birth, right? And also, when Brian was talking about the long-term care, the reason why this population is important for macroeconomy is the healthcare cost and how important that could be for restricting demand these days. And that, I think, would be a key difference, as far as I understand, between Ben Bernanke, who is coming here maybe tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, and sharing probably with you Monday morning, and also Larry Summers, who may come here in a couple of years, okay? So that's the background about the non-economics of why these demographic changes are important for macroeconomics. And then if you're an economist, I would say that people have focused on population for real variables in macroeconomics, like GDP, current account, and say consumption and investment. However, in this paper, we are a minority among economists in arguing that it's important also for inflation dynamics. And the reason is how this population dynamics could affect energy demand and so inflation dynamics. So if I learn enough from the two presentations, then I could write a model to understand how population changes would change inflation. We didn't go that far, and this paper is more about the empirical statistical analysis of how the demographic changes affect inflation. Yeah. So this is a picture for the world on the left and only for Japan on the right. Because as emphasized from the first presentation, Japan is the country where this real GDP growth is kind of declining. That's a blue line, a little more choppy. And also this population, the red line, is also declining as well. So there is a clear correlation on that. For globally, it's not as strong as Japan, but we can see some correlation. So we are trying to understand how population growth changes inflation dynamics. Oops, this is the. So if I don't have to reiterate, but demographic changes are in its watershed for many things. And when I look at different countries, I'll try to look at as it as a global phenomena, but it's an uneven process depending on the country and depending on the time and especially generations. And then Japan's population, for example, has been starting to decline in 2009. So fertility and mortality rates are drivers of demographic changes, but in this paper we are using more standard or traditional measures of population size and structures, and then share of working age population or youth population, elderly population, and then the most kind of preferred measure is the dependency ratio, which is showing the ratio. And then also we use population growth and life expectancy as well. So this is total fertility rate for the world, for the blue line, and then for the developed region, it's decreasing and then increasing, but for the less developed region, it is decreasing over time until 2095. So this is the fertility rate by major countries, and then not only that I am from Korea, but also because Korea shows up as one of the most dramatic changes. And then people say Korea is lagging Japan by 20 years, but it is also following Japan, like this population dynamics, by 20 years. It's almost exactly 20 years when Korea is following Japan. But unfortunately, Korea is doing better in the aging process in terms of being faster, which is unfortunate. But as you can see here from the dramatic process. And this is life expectancy at birth, at least I had at birth, and then that's increasing over time from 1955 to 2095. And this is country by country, and then again Korea, they grew by 3.0 to 3.5. So I remember when I was kind of in the elementary school, they used to have a slogan like this, only 2 kids, they will do well. Which means most parents have 3 or 4 kids. And so they were begging for only 2 kids. And then, but these days, please second kid, right? Because most people do not have. But mostly, when I'm talking to the young couple, they say, how can I have 2 kids since they don't have 1 in the first place? Of course you have twin, but that's kind of beyond their reach in most cases. Okay? So this is a dependency ratio. While from 1960 to 2000, it's kind of decreasing over time, but it is increasing very dramatically, and it's above 100% in countries like Japan and Korea in, say, 20, 30 years. So how do we analyze this from an economics perspective? So what we will do is typically assuming constant age-specific behavior. So this depends on how long the data is, but what we are trying to understand is life cycle earning profile, and labor markets, and the consumption savings behavior, which will affect investment and human capital and productivity. And long-term care could be this human capital and the parts. So there are various ways to understand it, but we are, as I said before, we are trying to go into this empirical direction. So let's look at the dot chart or the scattered plot first. So the horizontal axis is average change in share of working age population. So this means 0 means the share of working age population is not growing over time, And on the right, it's growing. On the left, it's decreasing. And on the vertical axis, it's average change in real GDP per capita. That's the most important measure for macroeconomists. How fast do they grow? And then the blue dots are for the advanced economies, and the red dots are the developing economies. And then for both groups, there is an increasing relationship, which means that as there are more working age population, they grow faster. And again, this is per capita. And then what's the link? And what's the channel through which economy grows faster with this young population? So what we do is run a regression of how these variables are affected by the share of working age population and share of elderly population. And then this is a typical regression in many of the publications by the International Monetary Fund. And this we copied from 2004 WEO, which is World Economic Outlook. And whenever they have this, there's big news in China because of the population growth and also the GDP forecast. So working age population growth is affecting GDP and saving GDP ratio in a positive rate part, but the share of elderly population is moving in the opposite direction. So what we try to do here is try to understand the impact on inflation. So that's our innovation in the economics profession, because most people did through these variables like growth in real GDP, savings GDP ratio, investment GDP ratio, current account to GDP ratio, and budget balance to GDP ratio. Those are a typical real side variables in economics. And what we are trying to focus is on the inflation side or nominal side. And then existing studies are very limited. And a few examples that have been studied already are, first, the change in relative prices and the long-term care and popular health care issues. That's the most important. And in the paper by the Katagiri, it emphasized the demand shift to service sector in the healthcare side and how important that is in causing deflationary impact. As you can tell, he's a Japanese person, and then they are trying to understand how this population dynamics affects the deflation. And that if it is related to the last decade or last 2 decades of Japanese economy, then maybe we should understand it from a structural perspective. That has a completely different effect if we understand deflation as only the monetary policy management. And that's why, one of the reasons why former and current Bank of Japan governors are different in terms of the understanding of the Japanese economy, and that's why different people view or evaluate current Abenomics, the 3 arrows, differently. And this paper by Jim Bullard, he is the president of the St. Louis Fed, and he studied the interaction among population demographics and how it is affecting this political process as well. So there are few, even though not many, there are some theoretical studies of how population affects inflation. And empirical evidence is even more scant. And one paper by the staff at the IMF, its title is Japan's Population Aging Deflationary. So it's a modeling exercise on how declining growth and falling land prices and real effective exchange rates appreciation from asset repatriation have differential pressures. And that's probably the only paper we found from the modeling side or from the empirical side of it. And then, in one sense, it's because of what they call monetary structuring in economics. And if I repeat this one, the italics, so whether or not aging exerts downward pressures on prices is irrelevant. central banker committed to do whatever it takes and should remain capable of anchoring inflation expectations. So how capable is a central bank? How much can it control the inflation? Is it something in population dynamics that a central bank cannot control? And that's the empirical side question we are raising. So in the big picture, so this is the kind of the big model we have in mind in running the regression. So when there are changes in population size and composition, of course, it is reducing labor supply because we have less people, and that's decreasing agri supply. On the demand side, when population changes, the consumption changes because of consumption propensity changes between young and old. And it depends on the life expectancy, because when you expect to live longer while your retirement age is the same, then you spend much less. And also the burden is coming from the higher dependency ratio, and it depends on how we care the elderly generation. That's on the consumption side. On the investment side, they will lower savings, and then returns on investment will be different. And also, it will affect the asset prices directly, because when you have a longer life expectancy, you are likely to have assets when you are old, probably more on the safer side, and then it will also change the financial intermediation. And so those will affect the energy demand side. So this will affect on the deflation side when there are decreasing population, and then in the agri supply there are less goods available, so it will have inflation. So both will be enforced in an economic sense. So what we did was, this is more of the econometric statistics, I'll be brief. So we run the regression based on 30 OECD countries. So Japan is one of them. And the period is 1960 to 2013. So depending on how much the life expectancy changes, this paper could be subject to the segregated critique of using the right measure of the life of ages. Okay, but so this is 65. So I was listening to your talk. Maybe it's subject to your critique. So we'll get bivariate relationship and also multivariate relationship, and that's basically how the demographic changes will affect the variables. Okay? For demographic changes, we have population growth, the elderly share population, and dependency ratio. So let me go to this, let me go to the multivariate. So this is, so basically we are trying to understand how population growth, share of people 65 and over, and then share of people between 15 and 64, and the life expectancy, and these are the population variables we have. And then openness, secondary school of enrollment, budget balance, inflation, and investment, and then constant term. So how it is affecting this growth per capita. Okay, so this is how the population side affects growth. And then if I go to this inflation picture, and so this is the most important table. So basically in the OECD countries, how population variables affects inflation. And then I have a bigger table in the paper, but here I just put the table for the OECD and Japan. And in statistics, at least in econometrics, the convention is you put a star when the variables are significant in a statistics sense. So you see more stars on the Japanese column. So when we work on it, in Japan, this influence of population growth is really, really significant. While in the world, it's still, you see the many stars, but not as many as in the Japanese case. So this is still significant. That's what we found. Okay. So what are the policy implications? So demographic effect on the macroeconomy will be great. And then in terms of the policy implications, in monetary policy, that's what I said in my first minute. Then when you set the reaction function of how monetary policy is formed, how do we understand population in terms of output gap and inflation dynamics? And that affects the monetary policy a lot. And for example, not only in the US and also in Korea, for example, the Bank of Korea is setting the policy target. Right now it's 2.5 to 3.5%. They are revisiting it every 3 years, and they're doing it now to set the target from 2016 to 2018. And I'm sure this population is one of the issues the Bank of Korea staff is looking at. And then it's also important fiscal policy and structural reform, which corresponds to, say, in the third arrow in the Japanese case. And then, and for further research, I think they try to understand the circular flow table I showed you, how that is influenced by the reactions of agents. That's really important. We are missing it, but after listening to the first two presentations, I got more ideas about how people change their behavior as we move on. Let me stop there. Thank you.